Is it possible to have a whole army of Stormcast Eternals painted in non-metallic metal style? Let's find out in today's video.
That the entirety of the cosmos is accessible to each and every individual's mind, connecting to the great mind, the great spirit.
Welcome back to the Studio Collectors. In today's video, we're going to find out whether it is possible to mass produce and batch paint Stormcast Eternals in non-metallic metal style. Because this is an army painting video, I've designed this scheme to use as little colors as possible, so that in between steps you can batch paint and mass produce these Stormcast Eternals. So for this, I've gotten my friend ScaryMiniPainter, who has painted a whole army of non-metallic metal Stormcast Eternals to test this scheme out and see whether this is indeed feasible. For this video, I'll be painting one Vindicator using the steps that I've designed, and ScaryMiniPainter will be doing the heavy lifting while he paints up the rest of the Vindicators. And let's see indeed if it is possible to have an army of non-metallic metal Stormcast Eternals. So as usual, I've divided this video into easy to watch and useful chapters, and the chapters in these videos will be Concept, Contrast, Non-Metallic Metal Gold, Non-Metallic Metal Silver, Blue, and the environmental effects. So without further ado, I'm going to go on to the concept stage to explain how I'm going to approach this model, as well as outline the entire process of this project. Welcome to the concept chapter of this video. In this chapter, I'll be explaining and outlining the entire process of how I will be painting this non-metallic metal Stormcast Eternal Vindictor. My approach for this model is to address the issue on morale. I know it can be very soul grinding to paint just one color at a time, just to see how slow your models are progressing with non-metallic metal. As well as, because non-metallic metal usually works when the entire model is well painted, it's kinda demoralizing to see one part fully fleshed out while other parts are still well unpainted and just bare primer. So this is a very common occurrence when you're batch painting your models, where you're just doing one color at a time, and thus I've opted for some sort of compromise where we can get the model somewhat painted to an even standard before moving up the non-metallic metal scale. As usual, I've opted to use contrast paints over the Zenithal highlight because this allows the base stage of the model to be done quickly and efficiently, so that you can move on to the layering and highlighting stage without feeling too demoralized with having some parts of the model just be bare primer. Additionally, I'm only going to be placing 2 levels of highlight per color, so that this streamlines the process and allows me to paint pretty quickly and see results very fast. Lastly, I've opted to use some environmental lighting, such as the orange glow from one of the sides, as well as the green glow coming from the swamp, and this allows me to hide some of the flaws from the speed painting process and make the entire army look very coherent together. So as you can see, ScaryMiniPainter and myself have vastly different painting styles. So it will be very interesting to see how my painting scheme translates over to his painting techniques. So all in all, it took me about 45 minutes to complete this Stormcast Eternal. However, because ScaryMiniPainter places a lot of emphasis on smoothness and blending, some miniatures might have taken him about 2 hours, but the fastest miniature that he's painted took him slightly over an hour. So if you're ready, let's see what's behind the process and get your Stormcast Eternal army painted in non-metallic metals. Welcome to the first painting chapter of this video. In this chapter, we'll be using contrast paints over Zenithal highlights, because what I've found is that Zenithal highlighting allows the highlights to be placed very well, and it also shows the volumes of the model. Lastly, when you put contrast paint over a Zenithal highlight, it allows the highlights to look really vibrant while having very deep shadows. For this stage, in order to save some time, I've selected the colors so that we don't need to thin down the contrast paints at all. Remember, it's always better to add on extra contrast than wick off the extra, rather than multiple applications, because this might cause some degree of tight marks. I know that you guys have seen the videos that GW puts out of how to use contrast paint, and that is a little bit excessive for my taste. So what I recommend for this stage is do exercise some degree of care when applying the contrast paints, so that you don't get a contrast paint in areas that you don't intend to. This will save you time so that you can streamline your own painting process. So for this chapter, my recommended colors will be these contrast colors right here. These contrast colors are selected because you don't need to thin them down, and they produce a wonderful effect with just one coat. So let's get those colors ready and let's get started painting the non-metallic metal gold. Alright, over a zenithal highlighted base, what we're going to do is we're going to generously apply on Netherrack Yellow from Games Workshop. As you can see right here, I'm being very careful and only painting the Netherrack Yellow over areas which I want to be developing into non-metallic metal gold in the later stages. Just pay particular attention to this and don't slather the paint all over the model. Alright, so I'm going to be using ultramarine blue for the blue areas on the armor. Okay, don't worry about painting over the white areas because we're going to fix the white areas with some AK Gen 3 paints later which are very opaque and they serve the purpose really well. Next, I'm going to be using Basilicarium Grey for all the silver areas. I find that this allows the metal to have a nice grey base coat while having a very deep black shadow. Alternatively, you can use Noun Oil. Alright, so now right here I'm going to be using Sigmar Brown for the bindings and the wrappings on the spear. Okay. Now that all the base colors are done using the contrast and the zenithal technique, we're going to move on to the layering for the non-metallic metal gold. Before painting the non-metallic metal gold, we need to consider the finish of the surface, which is probably glossy for this non-metallic metal armor on the Vindictors. So as a quick recap for glossy surfaces, the value distribution for glossy surfaces tend to be more biased towards the highlights, where you have more desaturated and higher values and slightly less mid-tones. So therefore, the contrast can be quite stark on glossy areas and I will only need to place a few layers on this stage. Lastly, do consider the shape of the armor before placing the highlights. I place a lot of emphasis on the shapes so that they communicate the form of the miniature to the viewer while painting non-metallic metal. As a bonus, the new Thunderstrike armor is very geometrically simple and it gives the painter a lot of opportunity to express his knowledge and experience while painting non-metallic metal. So for the non-metallic metal gold, these are the colors that I'll be recommending that you should use. Alternatively, these Games Workshop colors will work just fine. So let's get these colors ready and let's paint up the non-metallic metal armor gold on the Vindictors right now. Okay. So right here, I'm going to start off with the initial layer of AK Gen 3 Ochre. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to be focusing on the shapes. And these shapes are very clear on the Thunderstrike armor because I can see that Games Workshop has made a considerable amount of effort to simplify the armor. And this gives painters like me an opportunity to showcase and express ourselves for non-metallic metal. Moving on, I'm going up the value chain. I'm going to increase the values by adding a little bit of pale yellow from AK Gen 3. I chose AK Gen 3 pale yellow because I find that this really holds a very high value without losing too much saturation. Okay? And lastly, I'm going to be picking up the highest highlight with a little bit of ivory. And if you really want, you can also push it up all the way to white to really give it that nice glint of non-metallic metal. At this point in time, I'm focusing a lot on the edge highlighting, the peaks of the shapes, but always remembering about the geometric shapes. Okay, so after all that stuff, I'm going to be using Dark Oak Flash into the shadows. This allows me to retain some degree of orange and redness to the gold, which I find helps create the richness and the warmth of the gold color and helps me sharpen up some of the mistakes which I've made previously. So right here, I'm going to be doing some reflected light. I'm going to be using AK Gen 3 Deep Brown. This AK Gen 3 Deep Brown is a highly saturated orange color and not too high in value. Now that the gold non-metallic metal armor is done, we're going to move on to the next chapter, which is painting the silver parts on the Stormcast Eternal Vindictors. Silver is a really touchy subject because there are many ways to make silver look more realistic. However, in this chapter, I'm opting to make it quick and easy so that the viewer can immediately identify that these areas are made of silver metal. So we're going to be placing silver in these two areas such as the scale mill as well as the spear that the Vindicators are holding. For this stage, I recommend these colors to be used. Alternatively, these are the Games Workshop colors that you can replace them with. Alright, so let's get these colors ready and let's get the non-metallic metal silver painted right now. So now that the silver has already been done over with the Basilicaran grey, I'm going to go over with some dark sea grey mixed in with a little bit of AK Gen 3 pale yellow. I find that these two colors add a little bit of warmth and make the metal look a little bit more complex. Secondly, moving up the scale, I'm going to be adding a little bit more AK Gen 3 ivory into the mix and to push up the value. At the same time, because when you're painting scale mill, don't overdo this. You want to make sure that you remember the main geometric shape and not just focus on the individual scales. Alright, gold and silver have already been painted, and now we're going to go into a really short segment, which is the blue armor. For the blue armor, I'm only going to be using a few colors, and these are the colors that I'll be using right now. Alternatively, these are the Games Workshop colors that can be used. And let's get these colors ready, and let's get started painting the blue on the Vindicators right now. Okay, so now that we have done with the contrast, we are working over with medium blue over the contrast areas. Sometimes the contrast areas does turn out a little bit patchy because of the big open areas, but fret not, AK Gen 3 is pretty opaque and it can cover up some of this patchiness. Okay, so now I'm adding in a little bit of pale yellow and dark sea grey. This allows me to increase the value while not increase the saturation that much. So moving on, I'm adding in a little bit of ivory for the peaks of the highlights. So as you can see, just very few highlights and very efficient, very fast. And now I'm going to be working on the white areas. I'm just going to be using pale grey for some basic base coating. Okay, and then after that I'm going to do with a little bit of off-white to just pick up the hard edges of these white areas. Alright, so just a little bit of ivory here, just picking out the edges here. And we are more or less done with the details of the Stormcast Eternals. Now that the base colors of the Stormcast Eternal Vindicators have all been done, we're going to tie down the entire squad of 10 using environmental lighting. I'm going to be placing them in a sunset battle where there's some orange lighting coming from one side and some swamp reflections. As such, these are the colors that I'll be using from AK Gen 3. Alternatively, these are the Games Workshop colors that can be used. So let's get all these colors ready and we can paint in the sunset and the boggy environment right now. Alright, so right here I've done the Stormcast left hand side with Dark Wolf Flash airbrush, and now I'm adding in a little bit of wine red with a bit of deep orange to create the orange tone. So I want to create this reddish tone, and this is very iconic of any sunset scene that you will see in paintings and stuff like that. What I'm trying to create is I'm trying to create a warm red tone so that the orange can be built on later. So gradually what I'm doing here is I'm adding in a little bit of ivory and pale yellow into the mix, and I'm adding in also just a little bit of that orange tone that we have produced previously. Okay, so that was light rust, and this produces this very luminous looking orange, and I find this very good to highlight the red over. Now going back to some oranges, I'm going to add some lemon yellow with some medium orange, and this will serve as the highlight for these surfaces. Take into consideration that the local color of the gold is still yellow, so that's why I'm moving towards a yellow base.
Hi collectors, ScaryMiniPainter here. I'm here to share my thoughts on painting up the Stormcast from the Dominion box set in non-metallic metal. I found that using contrast paints helped speed up my usual painting process, but if your initial white highlights are not well done, this may affect the overall quality of the model. This isn't a big problem, you just have to spend a bit more time manually adding in the highlights and volumes that you need. While I did use the exact same colors as Kenneth, I made some deviations from his paint scheme that I felt best suited my own personal style. Firstly, instead of layering the colors from darkest to brightest, I went the opposite way. So I placed down all my highlights first, then I glazed the sides or circumference of the highlights with the next darker tone. I personally prefer this style as it helps me visualize the placement of the highlights better. While I usually spend a long time blending the colors on the armor for a smooth look, since we are trying to paint an army as quickly as possible, it's okay to just layer the paints so long as the color separation isn't too obvious. Hope you guys have fun with this paint scheme. Thanks for watching this video.
Thank you, Keith, for sharing your amazing insights to painting this Stormcast Eternals. And this is the entire squad in its full glory. Alright, so this is the Stormcast Vindicator that I've painted. As you can see, we have integrated the orange sunset and the swampy glow. And this is the Prime, painted by ScaryMiniPainter. As you can see, our styles are vastly different, and this is both of them together. While our styles are vastly different, we've found a pretty efficient way to do this, and just look at all of them put together. Find it really cohesive and wonderful. Good job, ScaryMiniPainter. Thank you guys for watching all the way to the end. If you found this video useful, do remember to give me a like and subscribe. And if you want to support the channel even further, head on to the Patreon and get a whole slew of painting content which we have been producing over the past year or so. Thank you all for supporting us once again, and if you want to tag us on Instagram so that I can give you some feedback, do go ahead, and I'll see you in the next Dominion painting video. See you!